The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and flowers. Id brought a huge bouquet lilies, her favorite. My hands were practically buzzing with excitement. Id been dreaming of this moment for months, planning the nursery visits, the weekends he'd spend at my house, the little rocking chair Id bought just for him. I could already feel the weight of him in my arms, that newborn warmth against my chest. She was propped up in the bed looking tired, but serene, and my son was beaming beside her. And there, he was swaddled in a blue blanket in the bassinet. My grandson. I moved towards him, my arms almost moving on their own, a magnetic pull. "Oh, let me hold him," I said, my voice probably too eager, too full of all that joy. I called John that evening. The conversation was strained, full of long silences. He tried to explain it wasn't about me. It was about her own past, some deep-seated insecurity of fear that had taken root and grown out of all proportion. He said she had trust issues from way before she met him, from her own fractured family. He was caught, I could hear it in his voice, torn between his new wife and his child and his mother. And he had chosen them, he said. Complying was the only way to make it go away. They deserved that. Then they told me Sarah was pregnant. You'd think news like that would bring joy. But for me, it was like a cold wave of fear. This was it, a clean slate, a new life, a grandchild, a chance to be the person I should have been all along. The hope was so bright. It was almost painful. I imagined holding that baby, of being a real grandfather, of having a purpose that was bigger than my own selfish needs. I started making plans in my head. Id buy a rocking chair. Id read stories. Id be there for every milestone. First time in decades, I felt a genuine, selfless kind of love blooming. This was my redemption. This was my chance to finally get it right. The day they came over after the baby was born, my heart was pounding. I had cleaned the apartment until it shone. I had bought a little stuffed elephant. I was so nervous, so eager. I looked at my son holding his own child, and I saw the man he'd become despite me. I was so proud of him. And then I turned to Sarah. I asked, my voice probably trembling a little, when I could come over to hold the baby. She didn't get angry. She didn't raise her voice. That was the worst part. She was so calm, so measured. She looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "We need to see a sustained change. Your history requires verification of stability. Before that can happen, verification of stability." The words were so clinical, so final. They hung in the air between us in that moment. I wasn't a grandfather hoping to hold his grandchild. I was a case file, a risk that needed to be assessed. My son looked down at the floor. He didn't contradict her, and I knew right then that he agreed with her. This was their united front. This was the boundary they had set together to protect their child from the kind of instability I represented intellectually. I understood it, of course. I did. What parent in their right mind would hand their newborn to someone with my track record? But the pain was a physical thing. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. The hope I'd been clinging to just evaporated. The redemption I thought was being offered had conditions, hard, fair, impossible conditions. I could have argued, I could have gotten angry. The old me would have. I would have played the victim, accused her of being cruel, of keeping me from my family. But something in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't malice. It was resolve. This was about the baby's safety, nothing else. And she was right, so I just nodded. I swallowed the lump in my throat, and I said, "I understand." And for the first time, I think I actually did. That night was the real turning point. I sat alone in my silent, clean apartment, looking at that stupid stuffed elephant. I had a choice. I could fall back into the old patterns, let the self-pity consume me, and prove her right. Or I could do the hardest thing I've ever done. I could prove her wrong. I chose the hard thing. The next morning I found a therapist. I walked into that office feeling like a fraud, but I kept going. I started talking about things I'd spent a lifetime burying. I got a sponsor. I attended meetings, not because a court ordered me to, but because I needed them. I needed to be around people who understood the daily battle. I took a hard look at my finances, which were a mess, and I made a budget. I got a second job, not for the money, but for the structure. I needed to prove to myself that I could be only path forward, reliable, that I could show up day after day. I documented everything. I kept a journal. I wrote down my therapy appointments, my sober dates, my budget balances. It wasn't for them. It was for me. It was tangible proof that I was building something new. I'd look at those pages and see the progress, see the pattern of a stable life emerging. It was slow. It was agonizingly slow. There were days I wanted to quit, days the old cravings would whisper in my ear. But I'd picture that baby, and I'd picture Sarah's calm, assessing eyes, and I'd push through. They asked for a DNA test. I didn't blink, I understood it was just another form of verification, another box to check. I went and did it without complaint. The wait for the results felt symbolic of the larger wait. It was a scientific waiting period for a biological fact mirroring the emotional waiting period for a deeper truth. The DNA would just confirm paternity. The real test was everything else. Months passed. I'd see them occasionally for short supervised visits. I'd ask about the baby, but I never asked to hold her. I respected the boundary. I played with her on the floor. While she was in her bouncy chair, I talked to her. I watched her grow from a distance. It was hard, but it was honest. I was earning my place inch by painful inch. Then one afternoon Sarah called and asked if she could come over. Just her. My stomach dropped. Was she going to tell me it was never going to happen, that I'd failed? She arrived and sat on my couch. She looked around the apartment, and I could see her taking it all in: the cleanliness, the stability, the absence of chaos. She didn't mince words. She said the DNA results confirmed what we knew, but that's not why I'm here. She looked at me, and for the first time, her gaze wasn't guarded, it was respectful. I've seen the change in you, she said. I've seen you show up, I've seen you do the work. And I want you to know that my stance was never about hate. It was about protection. I needed evidence, not just a piece of paper, but real lived evidence that you were a safe person for our daughter, and you have provided that. I couldn't speak. The relief was so overwhelming, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. She went on: you put in the work, when it would have been easier to walk away. You respected our boundary, even though it hurt. That means more than any apology you could have ever given. A week later, I went to their house. My son opened the door with a smile that reached his eyes. It was a look I hadn't seen since he was a very small boy. Sarah was holding the baby. She walked up to me and said, "Would you like to hold your granddaughter?" My hands were shaking as I sat down. She placed that warm sleeping baby in my arms. The weight of her was everything. It was the weight of the past, the present, and the future all at once. I looked down at her tiny face, and I didn't feel entitlement. I felt an immense, profound gratitude for this second chance, gratitude for Sarah's strength. Her refusal, which had felt like a punishment, was actually the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. It forced me to become someone deserving of this moment. So I agreed. What else could I do? Fight it? Make a scene? That would only prove her point, that I was difficult, that I couldn't respect a simple boundary. Agreeing felt like swallowing poison. It was a rational decision, the only evidence-based path, as you said, but it felt like a surrender, like I was admitting that her suspicion had merit. The relationship I have with Sarah now is built on a foundation of hard-won trust. We went through a trial by fire, and we came out stronger. She is the daughter I never had, and I respect her more than anyone. That boundary she set, though it was so painful at the time, was an act of love for her child, love for my son, and in a strange way, love for me. It forced the growth I always needed, but was too weak to pursue on my own. I am a better man because of her. I am a better father to my son now than I ever was when he was young, and I am the grandfather that baby deserves. The future isn't just hopeful anymore, it's real. It's built on a foundation of actions, not just words, on earned respect, not empty expectations. I hold my granddaughter now, and I know with absolute certainty that I finally deserve to. From the very beginning I knew she was trouble. You get a feeling about people, a gut instinct, and mine screamed whenever she was near. She came into my son's life like a sudden storm, and the sweet, considerate boy I raised just vanished. She replaced him with a stranger, a puppet who jumped at her every command. She was possessive, manipulative. She started small, suggesting they spend holidays with her family instead of ours. Then it was subtle comments about how I was too involved, how I called too often. She was systematically cutting the strings between us and my son, my poor besotted son. Just let her snipe away one thread at a time. The final straw was the baby, my first grandchild, a beautiful little boy. You'd think that would bring a family together. But she used him as a weapon. She barely let me hold him. There was always an excuse. He was sleeping, he was feeding, he was fussy. I'd reach out my arms, my heart aching to cuddle that precious child, and pull him just a little closer, turn her body just slightly away. Her eyes were always cold, calculating. She was punishing me for what I didn't even know I had always been. Nothing but kind to her, bending over backwards to welcome her, but it was never enough. She wanted my son all to herself, and my grandson was the ultimate prize in her sick little game. And she made the most outrageous demand, a DNA test. She sat in my living room right there on my sofa, and said it with this icy calm. She said that since there were unfounded doubts about the baby's paternity, it was best to settle it scientifically. I was flabbergasted. I had never ever doubted that the baby was my son's. The accusation came from nowhere. I looked at my son, expecting him to shut down this insanity, but he just stared at his hands silent. That's when I knew she had complete control. This was her masterstroke. This was her way of driving the final wedge. She wanted to prove something, to humiliate me, to create a permanent record, that I was somehow the source of this vile suspicion. I was so angry my hands were shaking. I directed all my fury at her. She was evil, pure and simple. She was tearing my family apart for sport. My son became a ghost. Calls went unanswered. When I did manage to corner him, he was evasive, his voice flat. He mumbled something about it being a difficult time, that I should just trust the process. I saw it as weakness. I saw him as a prisoner. I spent those weeks of waiting for the results, stewing in my own bitterness. I planned out exactly what I would say to her when the results came back, confirming what we all knew. I envisioned the moment of my vindication, the look on her face when her nasty little plan blew up in her face. I would be gracious, of course. I would tell my son he was welcome to come home any time, that he didn't have to live under her thumb. I was so sure of myself, so blind. The process itself was so cold, so clinical. We all had to go to a lab downtown. The waiting room was beige and silent. There were no pictures of babies on the wall, just certificates and diagrams of molecules. A technician called us back. One by one she swabbed the inside of the baby's cheek, so gently he didn't even stir. Then she swabbed John's, then mine. The swab felt like a Q-tip. But it was the most insulting object I've ever touched. I was being tested. My relationship to my own child was being. But there were little things, cracks in the story I had built for myself. Once, when I was complaining about her to my sister, I replayed a conversation with my son. He had said, "Mom, you just don't know the whole story." And there was a strange weight to his words, a hesitation, not like someone repeating a lie his wife told him, but like someone carrying a terrible secret. Another time, I saw her not from across a room, but up close at the grocery store. She was alone, pushing the cart with the baby in it. She didn't see me, and she wasn't wearing that cold, hard mask. She just looked exhausted, profoundly, deeply sad. There were dark circles under her eyes, and for a fleeting second, she looked like a lost little girl. I shook it off immediately. Of course, she was sad. I thought, she's miserable. Because she's a miserable person. She's created this entire mess. It was easier to believe that than to consider an alternative. The day the results arrived, my son showed up at my door alone. He had the envelope in his hand. My heart was pounding, ready for the confrontation. I was prepared to welcome my son back from the wilderness. But he didn't hand me the envelope. He just stood there, his face ashen. He looked older, worn down, in a way that had nothing to do with being controlled. This was a different kind of weariness. He didn't even make it past the foyer. He leaned against the wall as if his legs wouldn't hold him, and the words started tumbling out. It wasn't her. It was never her. The doubt, the suspicion, it started with him. He confessed that during her pregnancy, when things were stressful, he had a brief, stupid affair. It meant nothing, he said, a cliché he was deeply ashamed of. But when she found out, the trust was shattered. In the midst of a horrible fight, fueled by his own guilt and anger, he flung the ugliest accusation he could think of. He told her he wasn't sure the baby was his. The silence in my hallway was louder than any noise I'd ever heard. The DNA test, it wasn't her power play, it was her response. It was her way of saying, fine, you want to doubt me. You want to drag this ugliness into the light. Then we'll have proof, we'll have it in writing. Her coldness towards me wasn't about keeping me away from the baby. It was a consequence of his betrayal. She was walling herself off from his entire family. Because he had broken the foundation of their family. I had it all wrong, every single bit of it. The vileness I had ascribed to her, the manipulation, the cruelty, it belonged to my son. I had spent months building a monster out of an injured woman, and I had turned my own guilty, cowardly son into a hero in my narrative. The shame was instantaneous and overwhelming. It washed over me like a physical wave, hot and suffocating. I had judged her so harshly, so completely, without a shred of evidence, based entirely on my son's silence and my own willingness to believe the worst. I was the unreliable one. My perception was the poison. The confrontation I had planned for her, I now had to have with myself. I had to go to her and apologize. It was the most humbling experience of my life. I went to their house, and she opened the door. She didn't look angry, she just looked tired and wary. I didn't go inside. I stood on the porch, And I told her I was sorry. I said I had misjudged her terribly, that I had blamed the wrong person, and that I was deeply ashamed of the things I had thought, and said I told her I understood now, and that if she could. Questioned under fluorescent lights. Ever find a way to forgive me? I wanted to support them both in fixing this. She didn't say much, she just nodded, her eyes welling up, but she didn't shut the door. The family crisis was completely reframed in that moment. It was no longer about a wicked daughter-in-law corrupting my son. It was about my son's infidelity. And the monumental task of rebuilding a marriage. My role shifted instantly. I was no longer the aggrieved grandmother. I was a witness, a potential source of support, if they would allow it. My anger was gone, replaced by a sobering responsibility. I had to help hold this together. The last time I visited, she actually handed me the baby. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a seismic shift. I cradled my grandson in my arms, and he looked up at me with those big innocent eyes. It was the same feeling I'd been craving for months. But it was entirely different. There was no triumph in it, no victory. There was only the profound heavy weight of truth. This child was born into a mess, that my son created a mess I made worse with my own prejudice. Holding him was a privilege that came at a tremendous cost. As I rocked him gently, I made a silent promisito him to his mother. And to myself, I would not be a source of more division. I would do whatever I could to help them heal. The unreliable narrator had finally gotten the truth. And the truth, however painful, was the only thing that could ever let this family begin again. The air in the house used to feel different, lighter. I remember the last Sunday dinner, before everything changed. You and Sarah were over, and she was just starting to show the way my son looked at her. It was like she held the entire sun in her hands. He couldn't stop smiling. We were all smiling. I was making my lasagna, your favorite. And Sarah was setting the table, refusing to let me help. You were teasing her about her pregnancy cravings. And the whole kitchen was full of that easy, comfortable noise a family makes when it's happy. I remember thinking, this is the peace you work your whole life for, to see your child settled, loved, and starting a family of his own. That feeling lasted right up until the day little Leo was born. He was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a head full of dark hair just like you. Had I held him in the hospital, and my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. Sarah was exhausted, but glowing, and you were beaming for a few weeks. It seemed like that happiness would just continue. I'd come over with casseroles, help with the laundry, just watch the baby while Sarah took a nap. It was all so normal. Then the shift started. It was subtle at first. You seemed quieter. You'd stare at Leo with a strange, distant look in your eyes, not the adoration I'd seen before. I thought it was just new father exhaustion, the overwhelm of it all. But then you started making little comments to me. When Sarah was in the other room, his nose is so different, don't you think? Or I don't see any of our family in him. I'd laugh it off. Oh, babies change every day. I'd say, he's got your eyes for sure, but you wouldn't let it go. The doubt took root in your mind, and it grew like a weed, choking out all the joy. You came to me alone one evening. Your face was pale, your hands were shaking. You sat at my kitchen table and unloaded this terrible, festering fear. You said you couldn't shake the feeling that Leo wasn't yours. It was irrational, you admitted. But the thought was eating you alive. You said you needed to know for sure. You said you had to ask Sarah for a paternity test. My blood ran cold. I told you it was a terrible idea, that it would shatter the trust you had with your wife, that you were risking everything over a phantom eye. After that, family events became a special kind of torture. They'd come over for Sunday dinner like always. Shed carry the baby in his car seat, place him carefully on the floor in the corner of the living room. He was right there. I could see him yawn, watch his little fingers curl and uncurl. But I couldn't pick him up. I couldn't rock him when he fussed. She would swoop and do it herself, with this polite, vigilant expression. The distance she maintained was only a few feet, but it felt like a mile-wide canyon. Begged you to talk to someone, a therapist, to fight this insecurity, instead of giving in to it. You were too scared to face her with the truth. You were too much of a coward to own your own doubt. So you devised this horrible plan. You told me that you were going to tell Sarah that I was the one demanding the test, that for inheritance reasons, or for some old-fashioned family pride, I couldn't accept the baby without definitive proof. You said it would soften the blow, that it would give her someone else to be angry at so that your marriage could survive it. You asked me, your own mother, to be the villain in your story. I refused. I said I would never do that. I told you it was a betrayal of Sarah, and of me, but you did it anyway. You went home, and you lied to your wife. You told her that your mother, the woman who had welcomed her into this family with open arms, was casting this ugly shadow over the most beautiful moment of her life. You painted me as this suspicious, unforgiving matriarch, who needed a piece of paper to believe her grandchild was really hers. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Sarah called me, and her voice was like ice. She said she couldn't believe I would do such a thing. She said I had poisoned everything. She told me that until I got what I wanted, I was not to come over, and I was absolutely forbidden from holding my grandson. The ban. Those words crushed me. To be accused of something so vile, and to be cut off from that little boy. It was an agony I can't even describe. And I was trapped completely and utterly trapped. If I told Sarah the truth, that you were the source of this, that you had lied so blatantly, it would have ended your marriage right then. And there she would have packed her bags and taken Leo. And I would have been the one who lit the match. So I made a choice, the worst choice of my life. I chose to protect you. I chose to endure the blame. I stopped calling. I stopped visiting. I sent gifts for Leo in the mail, which I am sure were returned or thrown away. I became the bad guy you needed me to be. For months, this tense, silent agreement hung over our family. You would come to see me alone, filled with a guilty gratitude. You'd give me updates on Leo, show me pictures on your phone. All while I was barred from seeing him in person. You were living a double life. And I was your accomplice. The relationship with Sarah was destroyed. Any chance I had of being a real grandmother to that child was sacrificed on the altar of your cowardice. The weight of that secret was a physical pain. I felt it in my chest every single day. The breaking point came during one of your visits. You were showing me a video of Leo laughing, and I started to cry. I couldn't help it. The sound of his laugh was like a knife. I asked you, how can you stand this? How can you let her think this of me? How can you look at your son and not tell your wife the truth? You got defensive. You started arguing with me right there in my living room. Your voice got louder and louder. You were saying it was for the best, that we were almost through it. But you didn't know that Sarah had come with you. Shed stayed in the car, but Shed forgotten her phone inside my house. She came to the door to get it, and she heard every word. She pushed the door open and stood there, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The argument stopped dead. The air went out of the room. We'd make conversation about work, about the weather, but the baby was the elephant in the room, the unholdable, untouchable elephant. She looked from you to me, and back to you. Her voice was quiet, trembling. What is she talking about? What truth? You froze. You tried to backtrack, to lie again. But it was too late. The dam broke. I couldn't carry it anymore. I looked at Sarah, and I said the doubt was always his. The test was his idea. He asked me to take the blame. I watched her world collapse in that moment. The color drained from her face. The betrayal she felt wasn't directed at me anymore. It was all for you. The realization that her husband, man she loved, had not only doubted her fidelity, but had concocted this elaborate lie to avoid responsibility for his own insecurity. It shattered her. The truth was out, and the collateral damage was immense. There was screaming, there were tears. Sarah packed a bag and took Leo to her mother's. You were devastated. But you were also vindicated in the worst possible way. You got what you wanted. The test was going to happen. But now, it was a desperate attempt to salvage the ruins of your marriage, to prove something that never should have been in question. The test happened, in this awful clinical silence. We all waited for the results like prisoners waiting for a verdict. When the email came, you forwarded it to me, and to Sarah. The results were 99.9% positive. You were the father. It was the most hollow victory imaginable. It confirmed what we all knew. But it also highlighted the sheer pointless destruction your insecurity had caused. You had set a bomb off in your own family because you were afraid of a shadow. Now we're picking up the pieces. My focus has completely shifted. It's not about my relationship with you, or even with Sarah anymore. It's about helping the two of you navigate the aftermath of this breach of trust. Your marriage is hanging by a thread. The counseling sessions are painful. Every look, every word between you is loaded with the memory of that lie. And then last week Sarah called me. She asked me to come over. She met me at the door, and she didn't say anything. She just handed me Leo. He's so big now. He looked at me with those big, curious eyes. I finally got to hold my grandson. I breathed in his smell. I felt the solid weight of him in my arms. It was the moment I had been dreaming of for months. But it was so bittersweet. There were no tears of joy, just a profound, deep sadness. It was a symbol of a family that had survived the crisis, but was forever scarred. The innocence was gone. The trust, that fragile thing, is going to take years to rebuild, if it ever fully can. Holding him, I finally understood the full cost of your cowardice. It wasn't just about the lie. It was about your refusal To be honest with the woman you love, it was about choosing the easy way out. And in doing so creating a mess that was 1,000 times harder to clean up. You made me the bad guy. But the real tragedy is that you became a stranger to your own wife. And I am left here holding this baby, mourning the happy family that shattered over nothing. It started with a phone call, a private ugly thing. My son's voice was tight on the other end, telling me said no again, that she wouldn't let me hold the baby until some test was done. The anger was a hot physical thing in my chest. It felt so unjust, so cruel. After everything I'd done for her, for them, I hung up. And I just had to talk to someone to get it out, so I called my sister. I didn't even mean for it to go this far. I was just venting, pouring out all that hurt and frustration. I said things like she's keeping my grandchild from me. And how can someone be so wicked? I was just talking. But my sister, she's always been fiery. She said someone needed to stand up for our family, that people should know what this girl was really like. The waiting was the worst part. The lab said it would take a few weeks. Those weeks felt like years. The silence from their end was deafening. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would jump. Was it the email? But it was never the email. It was just the normal world continuing on, oblivious to this private trial I was undergoing. The next day she posted something. It was on her social media, where she has all these friends from church and the neighborhood. It was vague. But it wasn't vague enough. It talked about a new mother with a heart of stone, about withholding a grandchild from a loving family over baseless accusations. She didn't use names. But in a small community, you don't need to. People knew. The comments started pouring in, immediately praying for you. How awful, she doesn't deserve that baby. I'll admit it, at first it felt good. It felt like validation, like a whole army of people were on my side, confirming that I was the wronged party. I watched those comments stack up, each one a little pill of righteousness. I thought, now shall see, now shall understand the pressure, and shall have to give in. But then the storm really started. The post didn't just stay with our circle. Someone shared it, and then someone else. It picked up a horrible momentum. Suddenly people I'd never met were commenting, sending her direct messages. They found her profiles, they called her names. I can't even repeat. They told her she was a terrible mother, that she was evil. I saw screenshots in our family group chat. My sister was triumphant. See, she said, the whole world sees the truth. Then she posted her side. It was a long, calm post. She didn't shout, she didn't call anyone names, she just laid it all out. She explained everything. She wrote about how for months there had been little comments, jokes about the baby's nose not looking like my son's, whispers about her past. She wrote about the constant, subtle suspicion that had worn her down. And then she wrote about the final straw, my son coming home and awkwardly, painfully asking for a paternity test, because I had planted the seed of doubt. His mind. She explained that her refusal to let me hold the baby wasn't out of spite, but out of a need for a boundary, a way to protect herself and her child from what she called a toxic environment of distrust. She said she wouldn't allow her baby to be held by someone who fundamentally believed he might not be part of the family. The internet is a fickle beast. The tide turned so fast, it made my head spin. The same people who were vilifying her now started vilifying us. The comments on my sister's original post changed. YTA, they wrote, even though it wasn't that kind of post. You sound like a nightmare mother-in-law. Why would you demand a paternity test? That's disgusting. They started picking apart our family, our motives. They called us old-fashioned and controlling. They said we were trying to bully a new mother. The support we had felt so keenly just evaporated, replaced by a wave of contempt. The worst part was my son. He called me, and his voice was shaking with a rage I had never heard before. He was humiliated. He said we had turned his life, the birth of his child, into a public circus. He asked me how I could have been so stupid, so reckless. He said we had betrayed him, and more importantly, we had betrayed his wife at her most vulnerable. He told me not to contact them until this was all over. The silence after he hung up was worse than any angry word. Then the envelope arrived, the DNA results. My sister got it, and she was so excited. This is it, she said. This is our proof. This will show everyone. I was hesitant. The whole thing had already spiraled so far out of control. But she was insistent. She took a picture of the results, blurring out the personal details, but leaving the conclusion clear, a 999 probability of paternity. She posted it online with a caption that was meant to be triumphant. The truth is out. Vindication for this family. Now maybe the real victim here will get an apology. My sister called, heard something through the family grapevine. Is it true? She asked, her voice a mixture of gossip and genuine concern. "She's making you take a test," I tried to explain to frame it as this rational thing we were doing. But I could hear the judgment in her silence. Other relatives were choosing sides. Some thought she was a brave modern woman, protecting her child. Others thought she was a vindictive witch, trying to drive a wedge into our family. I didn't know what to think anymore. I started to lie awake. It was the final catastrophic mistake. The backfire was immediate and absolute, instead of the apology. She expected the post was met with universal disgust. People weren't looking at it as proof of her innocence. They saw it as proof of our cruelty. Commenters asked why we were celebrating such a private, intimate thing. They said, "So you forced your son to question the mother of his child, publicly shamed her. And now you're posting the results like you won a prize." The daughter-in-law was now the complete and total sympathetic figure. People felt awful for her. They saw the posting of the results as the ultimate violation. A woman had been forced to prove the legitimacy of her own child to the world, and her in-laws were gleefully sharing the paperwork. We weren't vindicated, we were monsters. The pressure became too much. The hate started coming back at us twice as strong. My sister was getting messages calling her a vile human being. I got them too. We had to delete everything, every post, every comment. We scrubbed our profiles clean. But the internet never forgets. People had taken screenshots. It was still out there, living and breathing without us. The shame was so deep, so profound. It was a physical weight on my shoulders. We had to retreat completely, shut down our accounts, hide from the very public we had tried to rally to our side. The apology I had to make was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't just about the paternity test anymore. It was about the humiliation, the public spectacle. I had to look her in the eye and apologize for allowing her most private struggle to be broadcast to strangers, for letting her be called those awful names, for contributing to an environment where my son felt he had to question the paternity of his own child. The words felt so inadequate. "I am sorry" seemed to mean nothing when measured against the scale of what we had done. She listened quietly, her face pale and tired. She didn't say she forgave me, she just nodded. It was a start, but the chasm between us felt wider than ever. The first time I held my grandson, it wasn't in a hospital room, surrounded by flowers. It wasn't captured in a happy photo for social media. It was in their living room weeks later, with the curtains drawn. The air was thick with all the things that had been said and done. My hands were shaking as she passed him to me. He was so small, so warm. He smelled like powder and milk. I looked down at his face, his perfect little features, and I saw my son in him. I saw my family, and all I could feel was a crushing regret that this moment, this pure and simple thing, had been poisoned by our need to be right, by our need for a public victory. There were no cameras, no comments, just the quiet sound of his breathing and the heavy silence of a family trying to find its way back. That video, the one my sister posted, it's still out there somewhere. People probably still use it as an example, a cautionary tale, a lesson that some battles, the most important ones, should never be fought with a smartphone. They need to be fought face to face, with quiet words, away from the blinding light of a screen. At night, staring at the ceiling, and the most terrible thoughts would creep in. That's when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it had a steel edge I'd never heard before. No, just that one word. It hung in the air. I actually laughed, thinking it was a joke, some kind of numb nerves. But her face was completely serious. She looked from me to my son, and then back to me. "I am sorry, but you can't hold him, not yet." What if she was right, not about me, but about everything else? What if John wasn't the father? What would that mean for him, for our name, for the future? I'd imagined the doubt she had planted was like a weed, and it was starting to grow in the dark corners of my own mind. I hated her for that, for making me question my own son. And through it all, her resolve never wavered. When I saw her, she was calm, resolute. Her politeness was a shield, and it seemed to get stronger every day, as if my very anxiety was proof that she was right to be cautious. Then one Tuesday morning, it came. The subject line was just a case number. The sender was the lab. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely click the mouse. I had to put my coffee down because I was afraid I'd spill it. The document loaded slowly. It was full of legal jargon and numbers, percentages, and graphs. My eyes scanned the page, not understanding any of the science, just hunting for one phrase. And there it was, near the bottom: probability of paternity 99.90. A wave of something washed over me. It wasn't joy, it was vindication, sure, but it was a bitter, hollow feeling. I was right, we were right. My son was the father. I had known it all along in my bones, but having it confirmed by a piece of paper felt like a tragedy. This should have been a truth held in the heart, not proven in a lab. I started to cry, not happy tears, but tears of sheer exhaustion and sorrow. I called John, my voice was thick, the results came, he's yours. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I heard him let out a breath he must have been holding for weeks. I know, Mom, he said softly. I never doubted it, but he had to because she did. They came over that evening, she was holding the baby, but this time she didn't keep her distance. She walked right up to me, her eyes were red like she'd been crying too. I am so sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry, she explained it. Then the real reason, it wasn't about me, not really. It was a ghost from her past. Her own father had left. And there had been whispers her whole life about whether he was really her biological father. It had left a scar, a deep irrational fear that history could repeat itself, that the foundation of a family could be a lie. She needed the concrete, indisputable evidence to quiet that fear forever. Then she did something she hadn't done since he was born. She gently, carefully placed my grandson into my arms. He was heavier than I'd imagined, warmer. He smelled like powder and milk. I could feel the beat of his tiny heart against my chest. It was the moment I had been waiting for, dreaming of. But it was different. The pure, uncomplicated joy was gone. It was replaced by this complex, fragile thing. I was holding him. But I was also holding the weight of the last few weeks, the suspicion, the anger, the waiting, the tears. The proof was in my hands, and the relationship was in pieces at my feet. Well, rebuild it. I suppose we have to, well, have playdates and birthdays and Christmases, but it will always be there, this foundational crack. Our story started with a demand for proof. The trust wasn't given, it was earned through a DNA sequence. And as I finally rocked my grandson, feeling his warmth seep into me, I knew that some truths, even when they're a proven cost, you something. The innocence was gone. What was left was real and painful, and ours. The confusion must have been all over my face. My son shifted his weight, looking down at his shoes. What are you talking about? I asked. It's me, it's Grandma. You have to understand, when she first suggested the paternity test, it felt like a deliberate slap in the face. We were in their kitchen. The sun was streaming in, making the stainless steel appliances gleam. It was supposed to be a happy morning. I was holding my grandson, just a month old, his little fingers wrapped around my thumb. He smelled of baby shampoo and that pure innocent scent they have. And then she just said it so casually over her shoulder. While she was making coffee, we've decided to do a DNA test just for peace of mind. Peace of mind, her mind, I suppose, not mine, not my son's. I watched his face pale. He couldn't even look at me. He just stared at the floor, at the perfectly clean tiles, and nodded. He muttered something about how it's standard now, how it's good to be sure. But I knew it was her. This demand, this accusation, wrapped up as a simple medical procedure, came from her. I played the victim perfectly, the hurt grandmother, the woman who had done nothing but love this family. Now being treated like her lineage was somehow suspect. I asked her, my voice trembling with a genuine shock that was only partly feigned. Why would you need to do such a thing? She didn't have a real answer. She talked about vague anxieties, about wanting to be absolutely certain for the medical records. But her eyes were sharp. They were searching me, not him. It was as if she sensed a crack in the foundation of this family, and she was determined to find its source, even if she didn't know what she was looking for. My son was a ghost in the room. He was always like that, caught between us, a good man, but a peacemaker to a fault. He wouldn't stand up to her. He just let her lead, hoping the storm would pass. So I agreed. I put on a brave face. I said, of course, whatever you need to feel secure. But inside I was crumbling, because her unreasonable demand, her cruel suspicion, it wasn't unfounded, not really. She had stumbled blindly into the dark secret I had been carrying for 4 to 5 years. The days of waiting for the results were an agony. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would stutter. I'd picture the envelope plain and white, containing a truth that could shatter everything. But it wasn't the truth about my grandson that terrified me the most. It was the truth about my son. It was the truth about me. The waiting took me back. It always does, back to a time when I was younger than my daughter-in-law is now. My husband was away for work for months at a time. The loneliness was a physical ache. And then there was a man, a friend, someone who made me feel seen again. It wasn't a long affair. It was a moment of weakness, a desperate grab for warmth in a cold marriage. And when I found out I was pregnant, the timeline was ambiguous. It could have been my husband's, it could have been the other man's. I chose my family, I chose security. I never told a soul. I buried the doubt so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't exist. My husband never questioned it. He doted on our son. And I prayed every single day that the physical resemblance would hold, that no stray gene, no unexpected trait, would ever give me away. For 4 to 5 years, I lived with that secret fear, gnawing at the edges of my happiness. I became an expert at deflecting questions about family medical history. I dreaded the day my son might get one of those ancestry kits as a gift. She took a slow breath. I need to be sure, absolutely sure, so no holding him, no unsupervised visits. Nothing, until we have a DNA test that confirms paternity. And now this paternity test, my daughter-in-law with her sharp, intuitive eyes, had somehow tapped into that buried current of deception. She was accusing her husband of being unfaithful. I realized that now her suspicion was a distorted echo of my own long-buried infidelity. She felt the instability I had introduced into the bloodline all those years ago, and her instinct was to secure her own child's place in it. She was the canary in the coal mine, reacting to a poison I had released. The weight of it became unbearable. The hypocrisy of my wounded act was suffocating me. I couldn't sit by and let the results come in, potentially revealing a truth I wasn't even brave enough to speak. I had to tell my son. I had to beat the laboratory to the punch. I went to their house. When I knew she would be out, he was alone, rocking the baby in the living room. The scene was so peaceful, so pure, I was about to poison it. Forever. I sat down opposite him, my knees weak. I didn't know how to start. I just began talking, my voice a low, shaky mess. I told him I needed to explain something about why his wife's request had affected me so deeply. I started with the past. I told him about his father's long absences. I told him about my loneliness. I didn't prettify it. I didn't make excuses. I laid out the facts of my own failings, my own weakness. And then I said the words I had never spoken aloud. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I couldn't be 100% sure who your father was. The silence in the room was heavier than any sound. The only noise was the soft creak of the rocking chair. He stopped rocking. He just held the baby tighter, his knuckles white. He looked at me, and I saw his whole understanding of the world rearrange itself behind his eyes. His identity, the bedrock of who he was suddenly sand. He wasn't just waiting to see if he was a father. He was learning he might not be a son, not in the way he had always believed. I explained it all, how I had chosen to stay quiet, how I had lived with the fear. And then I told him my realization about his wife. She's not crazy. I said, my voice breaking. She's not cruel. She sensed it. She sensed the lie that has been sitting in this family for your entire life. Her demand for a test, it was a horrible way to go about it. But it came from a place of wanting certainty for her child, a certainty I never had the courage to give to you. He didn't yell, he didn't cry, he was just still. He asked a few quiet clinical questions. Did his father know? Was there any contact with the other man? He was trying to fit this new shocking piece into the puzzle of his life. And then, he said the thing that broke my heart. More than any anger could have all this time, he whispered, I thought she was trying to destroy our family. But she was just reacting to a crack that was already there, a crack you made. In that moment, the roles completely reversed. I was no longer the wronged party. I was the source of the poison. My daughter-in-law, whom I had vilified, was suddenly the unwitting truth-teller. Her suspicion was justified by a history. She knew nothing about her actions were reframed from an attack into a flawed, clumsy attempt at self-preservation. A few days later, the results came. They were exactly what we all ostensibly wanted, a 99.9% probability that my son was the father of that beautiful baby boy. It should have been a moment of vindication for him, of triumph over his wife's unfounded fears. But it wasn't. He showed me the paper. We looked at it together, sitting at that same kitchen table. The result was meaningless. Now it was a footnote. The real revelation had already happened. The family secret was out. The lie I had carried for a lifetime was now a shared burden. The healing, the slow and painful process of it, didn't start with that slip of paper confirming paternity. It started with my confession. My son had to grapple with a new origin story. My daughter-in-law, when he finally told her everything, was understandably furious. But her anger was no longer directed at a phantom infidelity. It was directed at the decades of. The words didn't make sense at first. They were just sounds. DNA test, paternity. They were words for talk shows, for courtroom dramas. Not for this sunlit room with the lilies on the windowsill. My joy just evaporated, replaced by this cold, heavy feeling in my stomach. Betrayal. That's what it was, a deep, personal betrayal. She was looking at me like I was a stranger, like I had somehow introduced this doubt into the room myself. Deception, yet in a strange way. It also brought them closer. They now had a common challenge, a shared truth to navigate. They were united against the past, my past. She hasn't forgiven me. I don't know if she ever fully will, but she understands now. She understands that her intuition was right even if her target was wrong. Our relationship is different. It's quieter, more honest. There are no more illusions. The refusal to simply accept the surface of things, which I saw as her greatest flaw, turned out to be the very thing that forced our family into a more authentic light. The test she demanded didn't prove her wrong in the most roundabout, painful way imaginable. It proved her right. It proved that something in this family was deeply, fundamentally untrue. And I am the one who has to live with that, seeking a forgiveness I may never earn on this new shaky foundation of a truth I should have told long ago. I could feel it the moment I walked into their house. It was more than just new parent exhaustion. It was a tension, a current running under every word, every polite smile. My daughter-in-law Sarah, she held my grandson like he was a secret she was afraid the world would steal, and I was part of that world. The first time I reached out, just a natural gesture, my fingers wanting to brush against his tiny perfect hand. She shifted. It was a subtle movement, a slight turn of her body. But it was a fortress wall sliding into place. She didn't say no. She just made it impossible. Her smile was tight, an apology that wasn't really an apology. He's a little fussy right now, she'd say. Or I think he's getting hungry, always a reason, always a barrier. It wasn't just the holding, it was everything. She'd flinch if I got too close while she was changing him. She started asking these strange, pointed questions out of nowhere over coffee. She'd say, so your family's medical history? It's pretty clear, right? No big surprises. She'd ask about my parents, their parents, any illnesses, any conditions that showed up later in life. I'd answer thinking she was just being thorough, but her eyes would be analyzing me, searching for a lie I wasn't telling. Then came the rule about photographs. I took out my phone to snap a picture, just a candid moment of her and my son Ben, with the baby, her head snapped up. No, she said, and her voice was sharp, almost panicked. Please, no photos, not on your phone. Ben looked down, uncomfortable. I put my phone away, my face hot, with a confusing mix of rejection and alarm. What was she afraid of? What did she think would happen if a picture existed outside of this house? I tried to talk to Ben about it. I'd catch him alone in the garage, or when he came over to fix my sink. Ben, is everything okay with Sarah? She seems terrified of me. He'd run a hand through his hair, the way he always does when he's stressed. She's just protective, Mom. It's her first baby. She's reading all these things, you know, about germs, about everything. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He was hiding something. He was uneasy. But it was a helpless kind of unease, like he was caught in a current he couldn't swim against. Seeing his powerlessness scared me more than Sarah's coldness. This wasn't just new mother anxiety. This was a fear she had convinced him of too. So I stopped feeling just hurt. I started feeling suspicious. This was my grandchild, my son's child, and I was being treated like a biohazard, like a threat. I decided I couldn't just sit back and be offended. I had to understand. I had to investigate. I looked at my son. John, what is this? He couldn't meet my eyes. He just put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that felt like a punch. Mom, it's something we need to do for peace of mind. I started small. I'd ask Sarah about her own family, about her childhood. She'd give vague, clipped answers. A mother who passed away young, a father who traveled for work. She was raised by an aunt, she said. But when I asked the aunt's name, she'd change the subject. I hired a private investigator. It felt like a drastic step, a betrayal, almost, but the knot of dread in my stomach was tighter than my guilt. The report that came back was thin, deliberately, so it seemed her mother did die young, cancer. But her father wasn't just a traveler, he was a ghost, no records of him. After Sarah was about 10, the aunt existed. But she'd moved abroad years ago. There were gaps, big dark gaps in her history. The investigator mentioned a name, an old boyfriend from her college years. A guy named Mark. He'd been in a bad accident, left with a serious lifelong disability. The report was just facts, but my mind started connecting them. A mother lost to illness, a father who abandoned her, a boyfriend struck by tragedy. Was this it? Was she so traumatized by loss, by the fragility of life, that she was trying to wall my grandson off from the entire world? It made a sad, twisted sense. But it didn't explain the specific fear of me, the questions about my genetics. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. I was over for dinner. The baby was sleeping in a bassinet in the corner of the living room. I walked past it, just to look at him, to see the peaceful rise and fall of his chest. Sarah came out of the kitchen. and froze. Her face went pale. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice low and strained. "I was just looking at him," I said, my own voice trembling with confusion. She marched over, positioned herself between me and the bassinet. "I need you to leave," she said. Not angry, desperate. Ben was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of misery. That's when I saw it. On the coffee table, partially hidden under a magazine, was a brochure for a DNA testing service. One of those comprehensive health and ancestry ones. My blood ran cold. Why would that be there? Were they questioning the baby's paternity? Was that even possible? Ben was the most loyal man I knew. But the pieces started to form a terrible picture in my head. Her fear of me, the genetic questions, a DNA test. Was she trying to prove Ben wasn't the father? And was her hostility way to keep me from discovering the truth? The theory felt both horrifying and incomplete. I confronted Ben that night on the phone. I was past subtlety. "Ben, I saw the brochure, the DNA test. What is going on? Please, you have to tell me." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, then a sigh of utter defeat. "It's not what you think, Mom. It was Sarah's idea. But it's not about me." The next day they both came to my house. Sarah's hands were shaking. As she sat down on my sofa, Ben stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders. She wouldn't look at me. "I owe you an explanation," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "You must think I'm a monster. I've been so awful to you." I didn't say anything. I just waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. She took a deep, ragged breath. "My mother, she didn't just die of cancer. It was a specific kind. A rare, aggressive genetic mutation. Huntington's disease. It's a death sentence. It starts with little things, a tremor, a mood swing. And it steals everything from you, your mind, your body. It's hereditary. There's a 50-50 chance." Her eyes were full of a terror. I finally understood. It wasn't about me. It was about a ghost. "Peace of mind," my voice cracked. "Whose peace of mind? I've been your mother for 30 years. Who do you think you are?" That last part was directed at her. And I instantly regretted the tone. But the hurt was too raw. "When I met Ben," she continued, "I got tested. I couldn't bring a child into the world with that risk hanging over them. I was lucky I didn't have the gene. I was in the clear." She looked up at me then, and the raw fear in her eyes was overwhelming. "But then I started reading. I became obsessed. What if it could come from the other side? What if there was something in your family, something no one ever talked about, a neurological disease, something degenerative, you're so healthy. But what if it was a recessive gene, something that could show up in him?" Her refusal to let me touch the baby, her paranoia about everything, it all clicked into place with a sickening clarity. I was so scared, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Now, I couldn't ask you. How do you ask someone if they're carrying a time bomb in their DNA? I thought if I just kept him safe, kept him away. Until I knew. I ordered the DNA test. For you, I sent it in with a sample from the baby's cheek swab. I needed to see the results. I needed to see that there were no markers, no flags for the things I was reading about, the paternity part. That was just the only way to get a full comparative genetic workup. Without having to accuse you directly. I was so wrong. I know that now. I was so consumed by this fear that I turned you into the enemy. I was trying to protect him from a shadow." The room was silent. The confession hung in the air, sucking all the sound out of it. All my suspicion, my anger, my feelings of rejection. They just evaporated. They were replaced by a profound, aching pity. This young woman, who had already lived with so much fear, had trapped herself in a nightmare of her own making. Her actions weren't malicious. They were desperate, a terrified, flawed, but ultimately loving attempt to shield her child from a horror she knew intimately. A few days later, the results came. Sarah showed them to me herself. There were no red flags, no hidden genetic monsters lurking in my lineage that posed a threat to my grandson. The relief on her face was like watching someone emerge from a long, dark tunnel. The weight that lifted from her shoulders was visible. We sat at my kitchen table, the printed report between us. It was just a stack of paper, but it felt like a peace treaty. "I am so sorry," she said again. And I finally found my voice. "I am sorry too." I said, "Sorry that you carried that fear alone. You should have felt you could talk to me." We talked for hours that afternoon. She told me about her mother's illness, the slow, painful decline she witnessed. As a child, she told me about the terror of her own genetic test, and the survivor's guilt she felt when it was negative. The love she had for my grandson was so fierce it had become a kind of madness. The barrier was gone. The next time I visited, she didn't hover. She smiled, a real, genuine smile. And she asked me if I wanted to hold him when she placed him in my arms. He was warm and solid and perfect. I looked down at his sleeping face, and I felt a love so fierce it almost hurt. But it was a clean hurt, a good one. I looked over at Sarah, and she was watching us, her eyes no longer full of fear, but of a quiet, hopeful peace. We weren't just grandmother and daughter-in-law anymore, we were two people who had stumbled through a darkness together and found our way out. We had a shared secret, now a bond forged in the fire of a misplaced fear, and a mutual absolute devotion to the tiny peaceful boy sleeping in my arms. She didn't flinch. It's not personal, it's just a procedure. Until we have the results, this is how it has to be. Our family has always been steeped in tradition. It's the bedrock of who we are, a lineage that stretches back further than anyone can truly remember. And with it came very specific, very clear rules, especially about lineage, about inheritance, about the continuation of the family name. It was never about feelings. It was about order, about preserving something that was greater than any single one of us. So when my son's wife gave birth to their first child, a boy, the event wasn't just a celebration, it was a fulfillment of a destiny. The first grandson, the one who would carry the name forward, the one who would one day, if all went according to the old ways, assume a position of responsibility within the family structure. It was a beautiful weight, a sacred trust. And with that trust came a procedure, a single non-negotiable step that had been followed for generations, a DNA test. To you hearing that now, it might sound cold, but to us, it was simply a formality, as standard and as unemotional as registering the birth or getting a social security number. It was the final piece of documentation required to formally inscribe the child into the family registry. I remember trying to explain this to my daughter-in-law Sarah. In the hospital room, the flowers were still fresh, the room filled with that soft new baby quiet. I spoke gently, thinking I was simply informing her of the next step. I said it was a custom, a tradition that went back centuries, that it was about the official record, not about her. I truly believed that framing it that way would make it easier. I saw it as a rule of the house. She had married into a house with very old, very solid foundations. I never for a second considered it an accusation. The collision was immediate, and it was absolute. The warmth drained from Sarah's face, replaced by a look of such pure, unadulterated hurt that it took my breath away. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was a deep personal wound. She looked from me to my son Mark, her eyes begging him to say something to defend her. And he was stuck, utterly torn. I could see the war in his eyes, the love for his wife crashing against the weight of a lifetime of expectation. "You think I would cheat on him," she said, her voice a low tremor. "You think this child isn't his after everything?" I tried to explain again that it wasn't about that, that it was about custom, about the family laws. But my words just sounded hollow even to me in the face of her pain. She said the tradition was archaic, that it was an insult to her, to their marriage, to the love they shared. And then she did the one thing I wasn't prepared for. She pulled the baby just a little closer to her chest. It was a subtle movement, but it was a fortress wall going up. I was no longer just the grandmother, I was the accuser, and in that moment, she made it clear that an accuser doesn't get to hold the child. The weeks that followed were the most difficult of my life. The test was done, a simple cheek swab, but the waiting period became this heavy, oppressive silence. The joy of the new baby was overshadowed by this chasm that had opened up between us. I tried to bridge it. I went over to their apartment bringing food, trying to help. But the air was thick with things unsaid. I sat with Sarah one afternoon. While the baby slept, I didn't talk about the test directly. Instead, I told her stories. I told her about my great-grandfather who had built the family business from nothing, and how the inheritance laws were created to protect it from being diluted or lost through false claims. I explained how in the old country these things were a matter of survival for a family, a way to ensure stability through generations. I told her about my own mother and the test that was done for my son Mark. I tried to show her that it was a thread in a tapestry, a ritual that connected us to our past. And she listened, she really listened. And then she shared her own perspective. She talked about trust, not the kind of trust that's written in a legal document, but the kind that is built day by day between two people. She said that for her the request felt like we were reducing her marriage, her fidelity, to a biological transaction, that we were saying the word trust was meaningless. Without a piece of paper from a lab, she spoke about the vulnerability of new motherhood, and how what she needed most was to feel. Driving home from the hospital was like moving through a fog. The lilies were still on the passenger seat, their scent suddenly cloying and sickening. My hands were clenched tight on the steering wheel. A procedure. She called it a procedure, as if she was scheduling a car inspection, not accusing her husband's family of what was the implication, that my son wasn't smart enough to know if a child was his, that our family wasn't trustworthy. The whole thing was insane. Supported and believed in, not scrutinized, we didn't agree. How could we? Our foundations were too different. But for the first time, I saw the depth of her conviction, and I think for the first time she saw that my insistence wasn't born of malice, but of a stubborn, unyielding loyalty to a system I was raised to believe was right. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Mark called me, his voice tight with a nervous energy. He said the results were in. We all met at their home. There was no ceremony to it, just a tense quiet in the living room. Mark opened it, his hands shaking slightly. He scanned the document, then looked up. And the relief on his face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "It's done," he said softly, and he handed the paper to Sarah. She looked at it, not really reading the scientific jargon, just seeing the conclusion. She didn't say anything, she just nodded, a single slow nod. Then she looked at me. And she stood up, she walked over to the bassinet where the baby was sleeping, and she gently picked him up. She cradled him for a moment, whispering something to him that I couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked toward me. She held out her grandson, her son, and she placed him in my arms. It was the most emotionally charged moment of my life. The weight of him was more than just physical. It was the weight of tradition, fulfilled, of a rift tentatively bridged, of a new beginning. I looked down at his perfect sleeping face, this little boy who was the future of our family, and I felt the sting of tears. This was the blessing, this act of transfer, of acceptance. It was the ritual made real. Sarah sat down beside me, watching us. She didn't smile, but the hardness in her eyes was gone. She said, "I understand that this is important for your family, for Mark's history. I can accept that it's a part of your culture, but it's not a part of mine." And that was it, that was the compromise. She wasn't adopting the tradition. She was tolerating it. She was accepting that her husband came from a world with different rules, and she was choosing to love him anyway. We have found a new way forward, a hybrid path. We celebrate the holidays, both her family's and ours. We tell the baby stories about both sides of his heritage. The tradition was satisfied. But it didn't win love. Did a new, more complicated, more honest kind of love, one that has space for both a centuries-old custom and the fierce modern truth of a mother's heart. I always knew I had a problem. It's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. For years my life was chaos. Addiction is a polite word for it. It was a selfish, all-consuming thing. I missed birthdays, I broke promises, I'd show up hours late or not at all, full of excuses that even I didn't believe. I let people down, especially my son. I was a ghost in his life, a presence that only showed up to cause disappointment. There were so many times I saw the hope in his eyes fade when he realized I wasn't the father he needed me to be. I'd make a grand promise to take him to a ball game, and then it'd just vanish for a week. The silence on the other end of the phone. When it'd finally call, that was worse than any shouting. It was the sound of him giving up on me. When my son met Sarah, I could tell she was different. She had this quiet strength about her. She saw right through me from the start. She saw the hollow man behind the empty apologies. I tried to charm her, to win her over with my old stories, but she just watched me with these calm, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She loved my son, and she was protective of him in a way I never was. I think she recognized the scars I'd left on him. I was politely tolerated, but never truly welcomed, and I knew deep down I